This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're delighted to get to speak with Professor James Loeffler, who is the Felix Posen Professor of Modern Jewish History at Johns Hopkins University, where he is the Director of Jewish Studies. He writes widely on modern Jewish history, from antisemitism to Zionism, with a focus on the overlooked ties between the Jewish past and the global present in politics, law, and culture. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
You've published many books. Many of them will be familiar to our listeners, including your 2018 book, Rooted Cosmopolitans, Jews and Human Rights in the 20th Century, which won the American Historical Association's 2019 Dorothy Rosenberg Prize, and also a Jewish Studies 2019 Jordan Schnitzer Prize for Best Book in the Field of Modern Jewish History. And other books include The Most Musical Nation, Jews and Culture in the Late Russian Empire, as well as A Jew in the Street, New Perspectives on European History, which is one of your edited volumes. But I wanted to ask you first about this forthcoming book that you have coming up this spring. It's called Exceptional Hatred, Antisemitism and the Fight Over Free Speech in Modern America. It's being published by Henry Holt. So this looks like possibly the first trade press book you've done. If not, maybe you can explain to us and how this came about, this non-university press book that you're doing.
Sure. Thank you. Yes, it's coming up in the spring. It is a new kind of publication for me. I did a straight academic press book. Then I did what they called at the time an academic/trade book for my last major monograph. And then this is a pure trade, so to speak. In a lot of ways, this was an organic development. The book starts and ends in Charlottesville. I taught for many years at the University of Virginia, and it was written to try and understand what happened in August 2017 with the white supremacist, incursion, rally, and riot, and then the aftermath of it. So I knew right away it was a story that had a huge potential audience. I was also looking to push myself into a new kind of framework of writing for a broader audience for a couple different reasons, but chiefly it was exciting to just try a different approach to writing a book.
Yeah, so Rooted Cosmopolitans, which was that the book that came before?
Yes,
exactly. Most recent one. I noticed in the acknowledgments you worked with an agent with that book, which not all academics do for academic press books. What made you go that route?
Yeah, so it's great you mentioned that. Even with that book, I talked both to academic publishers and trade publishers. So I worked with an agent because I had an inkling even there. It was a timely book. That was a book about human rights and politics. It was controversial even then in terms of antisemitism, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So things were in the book that explained our present, and I thought this is a natural for a trade. So working with an agent was very helpful to understand what trade publishers want, and then also to just get the conversations going with both trade publishers and academic publishers. And in the end, it was a book that belonged more, given how I wanted to write it, with this academic/trade book that came out from Yale University Press. But I learned a lot in the process about what would be required and what wouldn't to write something that was pure trade. So it did what it needed to for that book, and it whetted my appetite to go in this new direction for the next project.
Were there things you learned specifically that if you were going to go trade with it, you thought, no, I'm not willing to do that, or that's just not the kind of writing I want to do? What sort of things came up?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely learned that trade publishers didn't want to know about the conversations in the field, right, which is a classic thing. And even the ways in which I was trying to write a revisionist text and say that a lot of prominent scholarship having to do with legal history isn't really getting the whole story. Trade publishers were less interested in that. Not surprisingly, they didn't want to know what so-and-so said or didn't say. And they wanted to also have much less law in it. I thought even for that topic, which is about international law, there'd be an appetite for it, but there was much less one than I thought there would be. They wanted narrative, they wanted story, they wanted pacing. So that was a clear difference, right, between what they were willing to do, especially, it should be said, for me, right? Who was I? I do write for the public and do, journalistic writing and things like that. But I'm not coming in as someone who, at the time, was a scholar that was doing a lot of press or media, and they could say, okay, this isn't just a scholar, but this is also a pundit, right? And so that was part of the process too, learning how they looked at authors as well as manuscripts.
Did you learn these things because the agent went and talked to editors and then came back and sort of reported, or did you get to reach a stage where you were talking to trade press editors?
It was the latter. So the
Mhm.
agent facilitated conversations, and those were really informative, right? I learned a lot from those because the questions they were asking were not the questions I expected. They were much more about how many main characters are in this book, right? And do you have to use organizations to tell the story? Can you tell this through individuals? Even if they led organizations, even if organizations were central, right? What do you think is necessary? Because they were making these calculations in their head, right? Or just about like, what's the narrative flow going to be like? What's the story arc? How are the different parts of it going to relate to one another? So I learned a lot from their willingness to talk about that, but also their pressing me, right? Who's this really about? And what was interesting was what I was asked less about was comparables. So I found agents who I dealt with, including my own agent, and publishing houses themselves, a lot of it was about comparables, right? We can look up, what's this book? Where do we slot it in? What else has come out recently in this field? When I actually spoke to agents, it was less about, what's your take on so-and-so? How is it different? Or do you see this book like so-and-so? It was much more about, again, what's the story here? And what's new here? And how many words do you think you need to do this, right? And stuff like that.
So that's what the editors were actually asking you?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
And about your agent, this is a very mysterious process for a lot of academics, how and why people come to have the agent they do. How did you find yours?
That's a good question, and I'm saying that because I don't remember exactly. It feels like a natural relationship, but now that I'm thinking you're asking, I asked around, right? I mean, and I talked to colleagues who'd done the same thing for their last book, and then I pitched agents, right? Which is just part of the process of reaching out to people, seeing if they're taking clients, seeing if they're interested, trying to get a sense of who they are, and using the networking that of people who'd worked with them.
For our listeners who are thinking about working with an agent or haven't yet, I think a lot of academics have this question about what would I actually get from an agent? Would they give me feedback on the story or how to shape that book proposal that they're then going to show up to the editors? And I think it really differs, but what did you find you got from yours?
Yeah, absolutely. I got two very concrete things. One was a process of crafting a pitch proposal, which for that last book was very long and had, the whole pitch, not just on audience and who will read this, but not just sort of an author's questionnaire type of thing that most of us get from publishers, academic publishers as well, for sure. But more specifically, what's the bio of you? Beyond the bio that you use when you're introduced for a talk, beyond the bio on a personal website, but really like, what's the storyline of you? Because that's going to be helpful for us to sell this to publishers. The second concrete thing I got was the access and the map of the field of just not only who this agent knew, but also what they knew was going on with that house and what they're taking these days, or, there's a transition going on. So it's going to be a good time to try and push through or not. Deciphering the map of publishing, that was really helpful. And then giving me a sense of what could be achieved through networking and what's still going to be a cold process of sending it in, with an agent's cover letter and seeing, does anyone bite?
That's interesting about the biographical part. Is that because it has sounded like with some agents, maybe with all of them, they're going to be writing, or I don't know if it's orally pitching something about you to the editor, that then what is done with that? Or I guess I'm still not clear what the use of that biographical narrative is.
Well, I think it depends on the book. But if you're taking a book which could go either way, academic or trade, and it's going to be pitched and pegged to a controversy or a moment, right? A question of our day, then the issue of the author's identity is really central. And it's going to have to be not just the authority of, each of us having labored in the archives as historians or just done the diligent, patient work of scholarship. It's really going to be not so much how do we sell this book around you, but where is the you in it? My sense is that's both because of marketing concerns, but also because if it's a trade press, they are really going to want to see, how do you think about this? Because we don't assume what you bring to us is the final version. We're going to develop this. So we want to know, like, what kind of a thinker are you? And are you going to bring personal into it, even if you don't intend to? Is that going to add an emotional layer to it that's important for a lot of effective writing? That kind of stuff. And then, of course, how are we going to differentiate this? So if there's just a number of people like you, you kind of fit a mold, that's one thing. But if we can do a hook, that's always going to be good for us. I'll add one more thing about this, which I didn't really learn until late in the process, which is that even when editors want a book, as may be well known to many people out there, I didn't know this when I got into this phase, they still got to pitch it to their colleagues, right? And they got to pitch it to the publisher of the house. So that is where your identity can come into play. And they can say, okay, yeah, this is a person with huge standing in the field, or this is a person who's made interesting, bold moves already in their scholarship, or this is a person who has kind of an international tie, and that could be useful. Anything like that, because they're looking to make their pitch as well. Once they're convinced they like the book, they want to take it.
That's interesting because I don't know if academic presses do that also, but I feel like a lot of us academics aren't used to the idea that maybe it would be our bio that would help differentiate or add something even more to the scholarship/story we're presenting in the manuscript.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it is, I think on the one hand, we're all hyper attentive, right? Over attentive to public facing, right? And that's just, we get the pressure from our day jobs, from universities. We get the social media effect, all that kind of stuff. On the other hand, I think sometimes we assume that who we bring to it is going to be basically a kind of tagline of me writing as a member of this community, right? Impacted by it, or as an authority. But that's not quite always enough, right? I think people still want to situate you as, where do you live? And where do you live? And can we place you inside a kind of social fabric? Because that's the thing that will also give you kind of not just a brand, but a public persona that's going to be really helpful to marketing it in and to understanding this book as a voice. The same way it really is for our friends, right, who really live in the world of trade fiction and those kinds of people, right? The author's bio is like really central to it, not just because it might be a new voice representing this experience, but because that's sort of how people want to figure out, why should I care about this? Yeah, sounds like a cool conceit for a novel. Why should I care? Oh, right, because this is we've never had a voice like this, or this is a voice which comes out of this, comes out of Gainesville. And that's a whole, now you can begin to imagine a world out of which the voice is emerging.
So I can imagine for this spring book, the fact that you were in Charlottesville at the time, a Jewish Studies professor at UVA, was probably a big part of that biography.
It was, and I said from the get-go, I want to frame this book. I want to be in this book, at least at the beginning and the end, talking about personal experience. That became a hard process because I did many different things in the years after Charlottesville 2017. As you mentioned in the intro, I was directing the Jewish Studies program. So like many of us, I had a university role, right? I was also a Jewish community member and a teacher. But then I got involved in writing about it for other publications. And so there was a trial in 2017 of the white supremacist leaders of the Unite the Right rally that led to that riot and violence. So I covered the trial for The Atlantic. And that was a great moment for me in reaching a new audience and a different kind of writing. But suddenly I was a journalist. And on top of that, later on, many years later, I was asked to be an expert witness in a hate crimes trial. So I found all of those rewarding, and all of them, feed into the book, but they're all different things. And the question is always, are you inside the story or not, right? And we have many historian colleagues who do that explicitly and others who totally avoid it. And the question is figuring out where you're going to place yourself in it.
Getting to cover that trial as a journalist does seem like a wonderful opportunity. How did that come about?
Pitching, right? I mean, this is the thing, like pitching. And I think I recognized that in this case, here was a publication that cared about this issue. They'd done some of the first reporting on the alt-right, and they'd had their own staff writers engaged with this topic. It tracked with their focus, but they didn't necessarily have a roving band of correspondents, and I didn't know for sure that somebody had cornered it, right? So I pitched it in the obvious ways. That I'm there, I'm in Charlottesville, I got a dual lens perspective on it, and also I'm willing to take the time to do it because this, in the end, was almost a month-long trial process. And so the question is, for journalists, for our journalist friends, like, is it worth it for me to spend a month covering a trial to get a major piece in a national magazine? And I said, I'll be there, I'll do it, right? And that kind of was a happy marriage of convenience too.
Were you teaching then, or how did you actually fit that in?
Yeah, that was a really hard juggling act. It was pretty surreal. I was teaching full-time that term. The trial took place in a federal courthouse a mile from campus. And so I was shuttling back and forth and spending a lot of time there. And pretty surreal, kind of like, because I would be there with a lot of, with the rest of the press, and they would go off to kind of kibitz and, like make sense of it and do their other writing and check their social media. And I would rush back to teach. It was also kind of meta in the sense that I tweeted about it too, which was helpful for me to kind of do a first draft of things, but then students would react to that, right? So then students are reacting to what they see me say online, and then they would come into class and want to talk about that. And I would say, wait a second, we still got to work through what we're doing here in this, in our syllabus. But that was a challenging kind of role confusion. It also helped me though, and I'll say in one key way, what I find a real challenge today is to understand how the teaching we do inside the university and the writings we do that's connected to our research, how it is going to transmit outside and vice versa, how that's going to come into the university. So just to put a finer point on it, I was very struck. The trial was like a very intense process, right? With media, people had come from all over to participate in this trial as defendants, as victims seeking justice. There was really little interest on campus at the university, a mile away. Students were just not paying attention to it. There were other controversies happening at the time. This wasn't one of them. So that was fascinating for me to be like, I'm ensconced in this huge drama, and I come to class, and the students who know me, as I mentioned, they're on social media following this, but there's no, you wouldn't know about it if you're a mile away. So that was interesting, thinking about, okay, what story do I want to tell about this? And as I talk about in the book, it was both a really important event and of reckoning, but it was also a missed opportunity. In a lot of ways, the trial didn't resonate even locally in ways I would have thought if I hadn't been also checking in on campus at the same time.
This book coming out in the spring is pretty contemporary then, or at least has a contemporary component. And I think you mentioned beforehand that you're actually writing about some live people. I don't know if that included community members or people you know, but how did that work in terms of, did you need to show things you wrote to people to make sure they were okay with it?
Yeah. So just to help people, I don't need to pitch the book to your audience, but it is a book about Charlottesville, antisemitism in the 21st century, and the question of hate speech and what we can do about it and what law can do about it. I jump back from there to two other moments in American history, and one is familiar to a lot of people, which is the 1970s, late 70s of Skokie, when American neo-Nazis marched through what was the largest community of Holocaust survivors. I also go back to the 1940s and 50s and kind of that epical moment of civil rights activism and a First Amendment law, and talk about what was going on then and sort of the forgotten thread of anti-Semitism in it. So you could tell from what I'm describing, there's a lot inside the book. And parts of it are in now distant past, and parts of it are very contemporary, involving living people. So yeah, that was a navigation process, right? The good thing is some of the people I was quoting and asking for their voice inside the narrative, I knew very well, right? And so there was a level of trust about what I'm going to do with this and be responsible in that. Other people were not comfortable because they said, I do trust you, but this is such a sensitive issue, or I don't want to be exposed this way. And with other people, it wasn't actually that different than it has been for other books where you do an interview, right? And we have ethical guidelines. Publishers have their own legal prerogatives to make sure attribution is correct and things like that. It was a navigation process, but it was fairly clear cut, I guess I'd say.
Mm. Well, it sounds exciting. I'm looking forward to it. To go back to the book before, Rooted
Yeah.
Cosmopolitans, I don't know if you would describe it as a group biography.
hmm
How did you, not all of these characters are well known.
hmm
How did you select them? Did the editor have any say in terms of letting you know who they thought would actually be more compelling?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it goes back to where we were earlier in our conversation, right? With the trade versus academic. I was pretty committed to these characters. They're not well known. Some of them were adjacent to really well-known events. I'll give you one example. One of the main figures is a man named Peter Benenson, who founded Amnesty International. So Amnesty is a huge organization. It's very well known. He, in some circles, is remembered, but he's not a household name. I was very committed to doing that and those people. And so that probably was a decisive point for me in ending up with the academic side versus trade, as opposed to threading or building around other people. On that side, though, once I was in that lane, people were pretty receptive to it. I mentioned even this issue about ready-made organizations, right, versus people. So once you're saying, yeah, I'm going to build it around biographies, it's going to work. The biggest challenge I found was I got to a point where I'd written the manuscript and I felt like, no, this is still snapshots, because these biographies are still presented as discrete chapters. So-and-so, their arc of journey and how that related to the 1940s and human rights, so-and-so in the 1960s. So I took an extra year and went back and rewrote it to interweave the biographies, which was much harder. And it was a hard process, I'll just say that. But that was effective, and they were supportive of that. Editor was basically said, you have a gut with this. It's already excellent, but if you think you could do something with it, try it. So that was where we went. So I had that. They gave me that runway, and I took it.
That kind of insight sounds like the type of thing I wouldn't be able to see in my own work. And we've had guests who said they've, worked with developmental editors, or they have writing groups, or someone who's always reading their writing and able to provide that kind of perspective. How did that work for you? Did you see that on your own, or do you have outside readers?
I certainly have outside readers, and I benefited from taking it, on the road as a work in progress to give academic talks and some community talks. I got a lot out of I do a fair amount of adult educational work. And that's just such a different audience, right? Because it's adults, right? It's not younger people who are seeing you in this hierarchical context of teach me to teach. And it's not colleagues who with a peer relationship, or even not a peer relationship of, senior colleagues commenting. It's just so different. I found in that moment that people were really curious about interactions. Well, did so-and-so know so-and-so, right? And you have this great description about this moment at the United Nations. So, like, who was actually there, right? That curiosity, which I think is a natural curiosity, but especially it's because of the way storytelling has gone and sort of the way we process so much narrative fiction and we process movies and things like that, and podcasts, right? And sort of how they weave voices in. People would ask me about that. Was so-and-so still around? And then I realized, well, actually, I should show that person was in the room, right? Or that network is there. That kind of naturally pushed me in that direction. And I think it made it easier to see that leap as worth taking, rather than to say, like, no, this could be amazing portraits of people and living through this time, but it's kind of sequential portraits of different figures.
Thank you. Yeah, selfishly, I find that a very affirming answer, because I know some of our colleagues feel like community talks are sort of a waste of time. And we often don't get, I suppose, points in the whole tenure and promotion scheme. But I have also found that community talks, that kind of feedback, it is that genuine curiosity from someone who didn't have to show up at this talk, but something in the title caught their attention. And they do ask those kind of questions that make you realize, oh, right, the reader would just wonder. And this isn't someone asking this just because it's going to help them write their journal article
Yeah,
or they happen
exactly.
to be in this niche field. So that is interesting to hear that that directed you a bit.
Yeah. I think for me also, when I do those talks, I tend to use PowerPoint and I like to use visual material, right? And I'm not the kind of person who likes to put up a lot of text on PowerPoint. So then it forces you into visual, like who are the people, what are the faces or photos. And even when you go back to write, and you're not necessarily writing a book with a lot of graphics and images, it still helps, right? Because it's like, okay, what should you be imagining in your mind when you're reading this scene? Even if you're not doing a very graphic description, who should you be imagining saying this? So that also pushed me in that direction.
That's a great point. Some of our guests who have worked with trade press have said that this experience has affected the way they write, or working with the editor has taught them more about writing narratively. You might have
Hmm.
already been doing this kind of writing
Yeah.
before, but did you find it shaped you at all as a writer?
Absolutely. I will tell you something that just came up recently with my editor, and each editor has their own style, right? But my editor said to me, and now said to me many, many times, I hate foreshadowing. And foreshadowing is sort of necessary in academic writing because you got to give the arc of your argument, because you got to prove your argument, and you got to sort of lay out where you're going to go, right? Especially for organizing evidence and addressing what's new in this chapter I'm presenting to you. But the editor basically said, why do you need foreshadowing? Like, if you're going to give a narrative, you've framed a question, you've introduced a problem, let us go with you as you take us through this, and we will get there. Do you have to front load it? And that was very hard for me because that's just, I think, a lot of how we're trained to think about our analytical work, but also when you do a grant application, like you want to front load, like why invest in this project? Or, giving academic lectures, right? You want to say, like, where are we going to go here? What's important? And using PowerPoint, which pushes us towards, like, okay, what are the key points, right? And I learned a lot in this process about you don't have to get it all in upfront, and you can let the reader be surprised, right? And there's a virtue in that, as long as you're not kind of blindsiding them with something that they're not prepared to understand where it comes from. That's a tricky writing thing, but that's really helpful and actually liberating when you think about it, especially if you want to just focus on what is narrative in this chapter.
On this topic of nuts and bolts of writing that editors might teach us, we've had guests who worked in trade and have talked about how they've learned to use fewer quotations
Mm.
and to let it come from their own voice more. So the reader really sort of feels you have a strong narrative voice. Not every trade writer does that, but curious where you fall on that, using more or less quotations for trade kind of writing versus what we do in our academic writing.
I've had to learn to use less quotations, and that is a challenge. It's a challenge, but I've realized it's really important because it could just overload, right? And trade editors don't like that. But as you just said so nicely, you can hide behind quotations. And I've learned that a lot of trade editors are alert to that possibility. Tell us more of what you think, not just your voice, but don't let the quotation do the talking. If you can summarize, it'll be shorter usually, but also we'll get more of a direct sense of you. And that's, again, what the reader wants, right? They want to be guided. They don't need a personal voice. It doesn't have to be necessarily personal voice or first person, but they still want to be guided to know how you are thinking about this, not just how you are platforming all these amazing quotes and voices you found.
A question that's come up from listeners is about chapter length. It seems like trade is usually shorter chapters, and I actually see more academic press books sometimes going in that direction. Is one more comfortable for you, or do you feel is more comfortable for the reader?
Yeah, I mean, I have gotten progressively shorter in my chapters over the books. It's still, I still find it personally challenging to do it. I see the rationale for it, and yet it's not as always as unidirectional as I thought. Let's just put it that way. There were some chapters for this manuscript in process that I thought, that's pretty kind of it's getting kind of long here, but I was told no, that's fine. You're not really running long here. And even if it's 1,000 words longer than the last chapter, as long as it sustains itself and there's not dead sections, it's okay. So, but I have also been very struck by some people, and there's some really wonderful books that are coming out now too, by people really going super short, right? And it just takes a lot of craft and discipline, but that can be really, really powerful. So I find that really kind of an intriguing possibility for writing by academics.
And chapter endings, and I guess relatedly, just sort of the page-turning quality of a book, especially with trade. Do you find yourself using any techniques, either about the ending of a chapter or otherwise, that are sort of with the motivation of just kind of that feeling of this, I want to continue with the story?
Yes, it gets back to a little bit of the foreshadowing thing, which is like the trick I found is to try and end on a finite moment, but still gives a reader a reason to keep going. And the challenge is not to make that an explicit foreshadowing. This is coming up next, right? But to kind of be like, okay, there's a tension here that's unresolved. And so you can linger, you can savor that tension, right? Okay, I got all the way to this point. I can see this tension. I can see how history didn't give us the answer yet. And so it lingers there. And then, okay, you turn the page and you expect to find something that's going to help you release the tension or take it in a new way. That's, you hear me, I'm lingering on it because it's such a great question and it's such an interesting challenge, but I think it's sort of how I try to approach it.
With this next book coming out with the trade press, do you see yourself now kind of firmly in trade press world, or do you imagine going back and forth for future books?
That's a great question. I think we right, academics who write need both. I'm probably more firmly in a trade space now, and I think to have another project lined up after this book is out, which is naturally a trade publication because it's a biography project. But I still see the value. There is enormous value, but I still see the personal value. So I wouldn't completely rule that out. I would also say, and I'm not going to surprise anybody, we just don't know what's coming, right? Academic publishing has changed so profoundly. I learned a lot about that too, and I think helpful to my own writing process was editing a journal, an academic journal published by a university press, right? So I learned a lot about kind of the financials models of it, how they vary between Europe and the US. And I learned how much things are changing rapidly in terms of how people think about publishing formats, lengths, e-publishing, and things like that. So I never say never, because also I don't know what's going to be next.
I guess among reasons some of our guests have listed guests who are academics but have sort of gone trade and have said probably staying there.
Mm-hmm.
People have talked about what they get from editors, the kind of feedback, which usually just an academic press editor cannot give.
Yes.
And I think sometimes people have said it just has felt more fun.
Yeah.
There's more resources also to go into publicity, even the fun of getting to see a book on a bookshelf in a bookstore, which can't usually happen with academic press books. And of course, being able to reach a wider audience and write in a style like that. Are there any additional reasons or tweaks on those reasons that our listeners who are wondering, so what's so great about it anyway, how you would explain why it feels good to be there?
Yeah. All of those reasons are reasons that I subscribe to, right? I think absolutely. I don't know that I would add too much to it. It's really thrilling, but it's also really important, right? To have our audience grow for our writing. I think that it is important to think about expertise, right? We're in a crisis moment, right? Where the society is antagonistic towards expertise in lots of different ways. Universities are under threat for lots of different reasons, but one of them is part of a general cultural position of kind of expertise is overrated. So I think there's a kind of moral imperative to find ways to really show what our expertise actually is, right? To just engage with the public, not just to inform people, right? To people have to understand this issue, but also to demystify us, right? As that we are communicators and teachers and researchers, what that actually means. So I think that's for me, that's a kind of compelling argument to lean trade or to aspire to continue with trade, because it allows people to just see the work, right? Is what it really comes down to see the work and see what we're doing behind closed doors.
Right. I think one of the things people wonder about if they would miss or if someone like you misses is the readers' reports part of it. I think I've heard maybe some of the trade presses. I don't know if Norton does that, but how do you deal with that absence of academic reader reports?
That was terrifying. It's like flying, it's acrobatics without a net. So I basically recreated it. I recreated it by, recruiting people who I basically conveyed to them, here's what I'm really hoping you will do. Don't hold back and scrub it and critique it, right? In my case, I organized a book workshop, but then for logistical reasons, it had to be sort of disaggregated. So I got people to commit to do a book workshop, which is a really wonderful thing. And then I kind of pulled them apart because nobody could be in the same place, same time, and just had them do it as if they were doing that. And that's proven extremely, extremely helpful to give the equivalent of readers' reports. And also, one other thing I did is I made sure to go to some outlier people who are adjacent to the field, sympathetic to the project, adjacent to the field, and say, this isn't really your bailiwick, but would you do this, right? Because that's the kind of person you might get with your reader report, right? We don't always get the reader reports from the person who actually is the expert in it. Sometimes it's someone who the publisher, especially academic publishers, have in their roster. Like so-and-so, she's very good at, I've seen this happen. She's very good at writing readers' reports. We trust this person. She's a political scientist. This is a history of political thought. Maybe it's not perfectly in her field, but we're going to give it to her anyway because we'll get a good report. So I've seen that happen. I've been on all sides of that. And there's something valuable in that, where someone who is not, writing in the same journal as you, but they're going to give you a fair read, but it's going to be an outsider-informed read as opposed to a really close peer colleague. So I tried to kind of find a way to recreate that too, even if I didn't have a formal peer review process.
That can feel like a very big ask. I don't know if it was just chapters you were giving, or maybe there were some folks who were actually reading the whole manuscript.
No.
We've had guests who've talked about actually the mechanics of building those contacts, or the fact that
Yeah.
some people who publish several books admit, I wish I had those kind of friends, but in truth, I don't have people who can read a whole book. Is this something you've learned over time, or how did you develop this network of people who are willing to do this?
Reciprocity really helps, right? When you're there for people. No, I think that's true. I don't know if I've had a conscious plan for it. I think I've been lucky. I think that finding ways, this is another argument for doing the work of academic journal editing as well as professional association work, because it allows you to develop a different, thicker relationship with people who may not be super in your buddies or your grad school peers or even working in your area, but you come to know each other and know each other's work through that. I think that helps to build rapport and to get people to appreciate why they can commit to doing what is a big ask, right? To read a couple chapters or a whole manuscript. Those are the things. I guess I've also basically willing to ask people to take risks and ask people and to say, if it doesn't work, just tell me, right? I'm not asking for a referendum on whether you like me and my work. I'm really asking, you're the person for this. Can you give it some time? And what will it take? In some cases, I found I've had to push myself to say, okay, I'm going to give this to someone sooner than I would like because I got to make their timetable. And that's, most of us don't like to let go of the work until we really feel it's there. But sometimes it's like, okay, you're going to have to trust these people in order to get there, to take advantage of their schedule.
As you mentioned, you were the editor of the Association of Jewish Studies Review,
Yeah.
a really, it is the journal of the field. And I know we have listeners who wonder about doing that kind of job. Now they're on the other side of it. Do you recommend? What do you advise or warn? You might not realize this about this position.
Yeah. I first recommend finding out what that means for your day job. Right? As I learned, and I didn't know this, some universities will give course releases, right? Some universities will do all kinds of things. Mine at the time would do none of that. So that really affects your workload, right? The second thing I learned and I'd recommend doing is finding out about the ed board. journals have all kinds of different ed board cultures, right? So some journals, the ed board really will get in the weeds. They'll help find reviewers. They'll help track down people who don't respond. They'll help you navigate complex situations. And others is a figurehead thing, right? They'll give you their name and not much more than that. So finding out what this journal actually is, those were things I learned along the way. I do think that the most important thing I learned, each journal has a different process for selecting their leadership, but the most important thing I learned is it never hurts to simply ask, right? The AJS Review now has a different process than it did when I started, but it never hurts to simply ask, hey, are you looking for new editors, right? Some put out a formal call, but even if you put out a formal call, you don't always get as many people raising their hand as you would like, and things come up. So it's a great way to sort of get in the process and learn about it. There's a lot more wiggle room, basically, is what I'm trying to say when it comes to it. Like, I'd love to do this. I know I can't. I'm going through tenure now. I can't do it. Doesn't mean you can't register interest and say, hey, next cycle, keep me in mind, or could I talk to you to know what you're looking for when the call for formal applications comes out? Like that kind of stuff. It doesn't have, just like with publishing, you can talk to people before you're even ready to pitch them or apply.
Actually, that is something that we recently asked. At what stage do you pitch an editor? And I'm always curious to hear what other people think. I tend to be of the mind it doesn't hurt, and hearing an editor's interest can be very motivating. What are your thoughts on it?
I absolutely agree with that. Look, I'm talking to you from a position of, I guess I would call myself a mid-career academic, right? I got my PhD in 2006. So as is the case, as you go on, you get to know editors because you do reviews, manuscript reviews and things like that, or you're on a editorial series board or things like that, or you're pitching them. So it gets easier as you know people and you go to conferences and they show up and things like that. But all of that said, I do think I talk to a lot of different editors. They tend to be really hungry for ideas and very grateful for ideas. It's easier if you're an established author. So that's the big caveat I'm emphasizing here. But they still want ideas because they want to know not just what's your big idea, but what else is out there, right? If you know there's a great manuscript coming along, they'll want to know about that too. I found editors are increasingly, they don't necessarily have the budgets to do a lot of published anthologies and things like that, but there's still cases where they're going to be really receptive to it if you realize, gee, nothing like this exists out there and we could do it pretty easily.
On the topic of pitching, book proposals really vary. I know we've had guests who said for trade, they've actually, especially as a first-time author, have had to do something like an 100-page book proposal that I think is also designed to really show their writing. How does she tell a story? And that after the first time, it might happen more quickly. But for you and your experience with academic trade or trade, what is the book proposal like?
It's varied each time. It's gotten shorter and more targeted, and it's been a lot less on the details of the chapters and much more on the arc and much more on the, I found for whatever reason, in my case, it's been much more focused on tell me how the story begins and ends. I don't need to know as much about how much variety is going to be in there. I don't need to know as much about kind of the sourcing, perhaps not surprisingly. I just need to know a story arc. So it's gotten easier. But I think what you said resonates with me, right? The first time going trade, or even going for academic trade, right? It's just, usually they want something big and long and lengthy that really gives the whole nuts and bolts of the argument.
I wanted to ask you something practical, which is about moving, which is something a lot of academics do. A few years ago, you changed institutions. This can be a kind of disruptive period for an academic's life, the time and energy with starting up in a new university. And I'm always curious how people handle that with their writing schedules. Did you find that it disrupted your writing, or did you find a way to continue even through that period?
Yeah, disruptive is the word. I did find that very challenging, and it slowed things down a lot. I am somebody who, for various reasons, started commuting to my previous job from a different city. And so I already had to deal with sort of a different approach to thinking about time, transit time, and things like that. So starting a new place was disruptive, but less so because I didn't also physically move. I just started commuting to somewhere else. The thing that I found very helpful was to simply tell people, right? I'm here and I'm going to do anything I can to be a new good citizen, but don't expect me to come to this or that, right? Just to sort of frame expectations so people didn't feel insulted or, well, we just brought this exciting person and they're a ghost. Be like, just tell them, no, I'm trying to get this over the hump, with a project like that. The other thing I will say, which was surprising to me, and this is a nuts and bolts thing, but it may be interesting. Like, not every university is the same. I went from flagship state public university to, from the University of Virginia to Johns Hopkins, right? Premier research university. The library holdings were different. And I was surprised because I was like ready to hit the ground running, and there was incredible library staff at both, but just what was sitting on the stacks, varied. Because of the history of the institution, Hopkins has a boutique humanities, and social science dimension to it, but it's a huge STEM school. So they didn't collect in as many areas for whatever reasons connected to that and how my field, Jewish Studies, grew there. So that was surprising, right? And I didn't realize that just everything was not going to be completely interchangeable. We have interlibrary loan, we have these things, it's a different reality than it was many generations ago or even decades ago. But that was something I didn't factor in, which did actually impact time and writing process. I moved in the fall of 2023. So what I haven't said and I can say is so I negotiated to come in residence with no teaching for that
great.
semester.
Yeah.
But then October 7th happened.
Yeah.
And my colleague, the director of Jewish Studies, is a woman named Netta Stahl, who's from Kibbutz Kfar Aza.
Mm-hmm.
And she lost family members on October 7th, and she was teaching and running this program. Basically, all of us had to step in and teach for her, right?
Okay.
So it's not germane to this, but it was like, the balance of like, I'm here, but I'm not here. And suddenly it's like, okay, can anybody teach a few classes? Because she literally has got to go back and forth to Israel for funerals. So that was a weird time to start.
Right. And Jim, I know you mentioned, starting at your new institution and not teaching. This is actually something I've heard a lot of people do recently. I don't know if it's actually become a more popular thing, but it makes more sense because there is so much time that you need to set up, not to mention all the trainings and HR things. But do you recommend that in normal circumstances?
Yeah, always asking for time is great. So yes, as I was saying, I negotiated to start this new position and said I will be in residence, no teaching. I'll do service, but I'm not going to make it to every department meeting. And in fact, they were very nice, said we don't expect you to. But I said, if you need someone to be on a committee, if you need someone to do this, count me in. And that worked because I think they were, especially deans, wanted to get the new hire there, right? So that was sort of a compromise, which certainly helped a lot. It did make it rough the next semester, right? Because the next semester, it's like, okay, the writing didn't end, but now I haven't had the glide path of going to the orientation and some of that stuff where, you learn exactly how to navigate the campus, the classroom, all stuff of that nature. But it was worth the price of that, like, jarring jump into first semester of teaching and the second semester of a year to have the freedom and space in the first term for that.
Yeah, I'm coming back to teaching next semester after a fellowship year last year and then a sabbatical semester now. And I know a friend had jokingly said, and another academic, that we academics who are coming back after research leave or sabbatical kind of need a support group, which of course no one on the outside should have any sympathy for, but it is it can be a hard thing to make your way back after time away from teaching.
Totally.
There's two questions that we ask all guests, and one is if there's something that you wish you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I wish I had known to go up and go down in terms of seeking feedback and critique. So my impulse, like a lot of people coming out of graduate school, trying to get a PhD dissertation turned into a book, was what senior influential people can I get to show interest in my work? And that was helpful and that's necessary. But I realized only in the process that just like in grad school, your peers, but even the people who are a little bit junior to you, right, can be incredible resources. Number one, sometimes those people can be very generous with their time because they want to get it right. They want to learn from watching someone who's just 3 years or half a stage in front of them what they do to demystify the process. Secondly, because they can just be still in kind of grad student mode where it's like natural to leap into something. And they have constraints on their time, but different constraints. So I've came to realize that that's really helpful, and you can do that. You can ask people for their feedback. You don't want to burden, junior people or students, but it's a useful thing instead of just always looking kind of who out there, the senior figures in my field, can talk to me.
Yeah, I was also late in realizing that. I wondered how you deal with hard or maybe even harsh feedback, if this has ever come up. I know it's something many of us academics experience, and it can be hard when you get it, but I'm curious if you've learned how to deal with it over time.
Yeah, I mean, the first reader report I ever got was really vicious, and it was the the senior scholar, revealed himself because he said it's probably pretty obvious because of what I'm saying. So that helped, right? Once you've had that experience, you're hardened by it. And I think I mentioned earlier in our conversation editing an academic journal, right? So there's nothing like seeing a huge array of readers' reports come back in, peer review reports, to see that sometimes people are just jerks, or sometimes smart people are lazy in how they critique work, or people can be genuinely invested in it and still be rude, or yeah, sometimes it has to be said, this isn't the best work. And if you're an editor, you can see kind of both sides of it. You can see, like, I like this piece, and I agree it's not there yet. They got to work hard. They have to change something. So that helped me to basically realize, like, it's not only an ego blow, and it's not only a referendum, right? It's a process shaped by many different factors, so you can take from it. And sometimes you can ignore it, because sometimes what matters, trade or academic, what matters is mostly what you think and what your editor thinks. The editor may say, like, don't worry about that. I like what you're doing. Think about the question, answer it, and then move on.
Yeah. Another question we ask is if there is a writing practice or habit that's working for you.
Yeah. Two things that come to mind when I think about what works for me, and they're both things I've more recently. The first is very practical. I'm someone who has to commute a lot. Like many of us, I travel for talks and this and that, but also I commute a lot. And I used to struggle with that time. I was like, okay, maybe this is time where I could just listen to a book and learn something. Then I decided, you know what? I'm also just going to dictate to myself. It's going to come out garbled. It's not going to be perfect, but I'll know what I mean when I either do an auto transcription or I just use it in email and dictate to myself when I'm riding in a bus or even in a car driving. And I let it just run. And that's helpful to me because it just becomes an ideational process of using that time to let the mind wander, to do the kind of stuff you need to do. The second thing I realized is that we talked earlier about quotes, right? And one of the hardest things with quotes is to let go of something that just is such a great line, right? And that's true for our own writing. So I always struggled with that. And finally, I came to an insight that this is going to sound totally pretentious, but if you think of us as artists, which writing is, right? Artists will spend forever like in a studio doing multiple drafts or multiple recordings, takes of a song or sketches. And so much of that stuff never sees the light of day, right? And that's okay because that's what they have to do to get to the final product. But also artists, if you talk to artists, they'll say that's part of the process. It's an end in and of itself, right? It's creativity. That for me was liberating, that insight, because it meant, okay, it's all writing. And if it doesn't go into the book, I don't have to panic about it. Like, I got to get that line in. I can just say, okay, it's part of the process. That's sort of just a mental exercise. I have found that very helpful for letting go, because that's what so much of writing is, after all, right? Letting go.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much, Jim. This was really fun and interesting.
Thank you. Great to talk about it.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.